The air in the winding room is already warm, and it carries the dry smell of cotton lint mixed with machine oil. Above you, the line shafts are beginning their steady turn, belts whispering into motion before the full light has reached the mill yard. Your station waits with its baskets of empty tubes, a few partly filled bobbins, and a wooden frame polished smooth by many hands. This is not grand work, and not rare work, but it is exact, and the morning depends on small decisions made early. You take the first length of yarn between finger and thumb, feeling at once where it is firm, where it is soft, and where it may break if hurried. Nearby, other workers settle into their places, and the room fills by degrees with the practical sounds of cotton being made ready for its next journey. A bobbin winder's day is spent in these repeated acts, threading, tying, watching, replacing, counting, and listening for the slight change that means trouble. In Bombay, around 1910, this careful labor sat quietly between spinning and weaving, rarely noticed unless something went wrong. And so, before the room reaches its full noise, it is worth lingering here for a moment to see how an ordinary shift was really held together. You have come in before the sun has done much more than pale the sky above the mill chimneys, and already the compound has that half-awake feeling of a place that never quite sleeps. The gate has admitted a steady stream of workers, some speaking softly, some not speaking at all, each moving with the practiced economy of people who know where the day will begin. The cotton mills of Bombay had their own kind of morning, not pastoral, not silent, but regular, almost tidal, with bodies arriving in waves and the machinery taking hold a little at a time. By 1910, the city was one of the great cotton centers of the empire, its mills fed by raw cotton from Western India and tied by trade to markets far beyond the harbor. Yet inside a room like this, the large story narrows quickly into touch. You know your frame by feel before you know it by sight in full light. The wood is smoothed where fingers have rested. The iron parts hold the night's stored coolness for only a few minutes. Then the whole station begins to warm under motion. At your feet are the baskets for empties, and the baskets for what has come in from spinning, small packages of yarn waiting to be transferred into a form the next department can use. Depending on the mill and the exact cloth being made, those finished packages may go onward for warping, or toward the looms as filling on perns or weft bobbins. But first, they must be wound cleanly. That word matters here. Cleanly. Not merely quickly, not merely full. A badly wound bobbin can undo the labor of several rooms. If the yarn crosses badly, if the tension changes too much from one layer to the next, if a weak patch is buried where no one sees it, then trouble travels onward, and someone farther down the line pays for it in stoppages. So the first act of the day is not speed, it is inspection. You lift one of the partly prepared packages from spinning and turn it in your hand. At once, your thumb finds a soft place. A little farther along, there is too much twist, a wiry resistance where the thread wants to kink back on itself. That is the first change in the morning, and it comes before the room is fully started. This batch is uneven, not ruinous, not impossible, but uneven enough that if you set the frame at the usual pace, the yarn will snap more often than it should. Another package shows the same fault, then another. You do not need anyone to announce a problem. The thread says it for itself. A bobbin winder in a Bombay mill was not simply feeding yarn into a machine and standing back. The work called for close fingers and quicker judgment than outside observers often understood. Factory reports could reduce labor into counts and wages, but the room itself ran on little acts of reading material by hand and ear. The yarn came from earlier processes that might include carding, drawing, roving, and spinning, each stage changing loose cotton into something finer, stronger, and more regular. But no sequence of machines made every batch equal. Humidity shifted, rollers wore down. Travelers and spindles in the spinning room left their own signatures on the work. And in the winding room, those signatures returned as inconvenience, delay, or waste. You have a choice now, and it arrives so early that no one else may notice it at first. You can start at the expected pace, hope the weak places are few, and spend the next hour tying break after break. Or you can begin more slowly, sort the worst packages aside, and lose time immediately in order to save time later. Neither option feels generous. The room is filling. Belts are fully engaged now. A floor supervisor is already moving down the aisle, glancing from station to station, not lingering long enough to solve anything, only long enough to see whether the day appears to be in motion. So you choose the slower beginning. It is a small decision, almost invisible, just a hand reaching for one package and not another, just a frame not driven quite as fast at first. But the decision sets the shape of the whole morning. You place the softest copse aside in a separate basket. You draw a sounder thread through the guide. You thread the yarn through the tension point with care, not forcing it, then secure the end on the weighting tube. The spindle begins its turn. The empty tube takes the yarn and starts to build its neat little body, layer by layer. You watch the first turns closely. A proper build has its own quiet geometry. Too much slack and it grows soft, liable to collapse or snarl later. Too hard, and the yarn is stretched or compressed in ways that invite fresh trouble. The best winding looks almost modest, orderly, even, easy to overlook unless you know how many failed attempts lie behind that appearance. Nearby, other workers are making the same early judgments in their own ways. Some start fast and accept the breakages. Some pick through their incoming material before beginning. Some have been given better lots, or perhaps only luckier ones. In a crowded room, fairness is hard to see from one station. What you know is only what is in your hands. The first break comes within minutes. Not a loud event, just a change in sound, a light twitch, and then the thin end gone loose where it should have been drawing steadily. You stop that spindle, find the two ends, moisten fingers very slightly, and tie them with the smallest knot you can manage. A large knot will catch later, a clumsy knot will slip. The ideal repair is almost invisible, though no repair is ever as good as an unbroken thread. You start again. For a brief stretch it runs well, then another weak place appears. This is how time begins to leak from a shift, not in dramatic losses, but in repeated little recoveries. A tie here, a stop there, a pause to clear fluff from a guide, a glance down to be sure the correct tube is taking the correct yarn count. You keep sorting the worst material aside, and soon the separate basket is no longer an afterthought. It is becoming evidence. If anyone asks later why your count started low, the answer will be sitting there in plain view, a small mound of troublesome packages not yet trusted to the frame. But setting bad material aside creates its own second problem. The better packages are going through first, which means the reserve of easier work will not last. You are borrowing calm from later hours. That, too, is a decision. This kind of labor lived on such exchanges, a little delay accepted now, in hopes of fewer stoppages later. A little extra care at one station, in hopes of smoother weaving in another room the worker might never enter. Mill work could be described in timetables and output records, and often was, yet beneath those records there was a daily traffic of judgment that rarely made it into ledgers. The winding room was one of those in-between places where the quality of earlier work met the demands of what came next. You can hear the room thickening around you as the hour settles. By now, the shafting overhead no longer sounds tentative. It has reached its steady note. Belts move with confidence. Wooden frames tremble faintly under their tasks. And as the noise gathers, workers begin to rely less on ordinary conversation and more on glances, gestures, and that skilled listening which notices one wrong sound inside many right ones. A spindle in trouble has a different tone. So does a guide clogged with lint. So does a bobbin winding too loosely, its layers shifting with a duller, less certain whisper. You begin to work almost in measures. Thread, guide, wrap, start. Watch the lay of the yarn. Shift your hand to the next. Replace a filling tube. Set aside a doubtful package. Tie another break. Count under your breath. Not loudly enough to be heard beyond your own space. Only enough to keep the number from slipping away. This was one reason the work was tiring in a way outsiders did not always understand. The body repeated itself, but the attention could not fully rest. Every movement looked much like the one before it, yet each could go wrong in a slightly different way. The room demanded steadiness without granting stillness. And now a third development arrives, not from your own batch, but from the station beside you. The worker there has had worse luck than you. You notice it first in the clutter. A few extra partly wound bobbins resting where they should not be. Then more broken ends hanging. Then baskets edging farther into the shared floor space between your stations. The neighboring yarn is breaking often enough that the work has begun to back up physically, and in a room like this, delay takes up room before it takes up words. There is less space to shift your feet, less space for empties, less space for waste. The other worker is not idle. Far from it. Her hands are quick, but quick hands cannot force bad thread into obedience. An overseer passes once, looks, and moves on. Perhaps he means to return. Perhaps he assumes the trouble will settle itself. Perhaps he is occupied by 3 other small failures elsewhere in the room. Whatever the reason, no rearrangement comes. And because it does not come, the burden begins to slide sideways. One of the spare baskets nudges against your frame. You move it back with your ankle. A few minutes later it returns, filled higher than before. This is the practical truth of mill rooms that neat diagrams never show. One station's trouble rarely stays at one station. Yarn, baskets, floor space, waiting material, even the attention of supervisors all spill across invisible boundaries. You can ignore it and try to hold your own line. That would be understandable. You are already behind the expected pace because of the poor lot you sorted aside. Or you can take a share of the neighboring load before the congestion slows both of you. Again, the choice is quiet, but it matters. You take one basket, not all of it, just enough to clear the floor and keep the disorder from spreading. No speech is needed beyond a quick look of agreement. In many mills, such unofficial adjustments were part of the working day, especially where women and children, jobbers, overlookers, and hands of many backgrounds had to keep output moving despite imperfect planning. Rules existed. So did improvisation. You draw one of the neighboring packages toward you and feel at once that it is not quite the same as the yarn you have been handling. The count is different. Finer, perhaps, or simply wound differently from spinning. It needs a slightly altered touch. The tension that worked a moment ago may be too firm for this. If you forget that, the thread will tell you immediately by crossing badly or snapping where it should have run. So now your station holds not one problem but 2. Your own uneven morning batch, partly sorted, and another worker's delayed material, close enough to become yours for a while. The effect is subtle, but serious. Your hands must now remember separate behaviors. This basket goes at the gentler start. That one can take a little more speed. These tubes are sound. Those have rough edges and must be checked before use. A damaged tube can cut or fray thread almost invisibly, turning a good lot into a troublesome one. So even the empties require inspection. You run a thumb around the lip of one and feel a nick. It goes aside. Another is slightly crushed and will not take the build properly. Aside again. The best winding workers were often good housekeepers of material, as much as movers of it. Because disorder disguised causes. If everything mixed together on the floor, no one could later say whether the fault came from spinning, from a rough tube, from careless tying, or from haste. You begin making little islands of order. Good tubes on one side, questionable ones near your foot. Your own bad morning lot in the separate basket. The neighboring yarn in front, where you can remember to treat it differently. This arrangement takes seconds, but saves minutes. And in the middle of it, another sign appears. The newer basket, the one you borrowed from the neighboring station, contains several packages marked from the same lot, the same chalked or tagged origin. At first, that seems ordinary. Material comes in groups, but as you wind through them, a pattern shows itself. They do not merely break, they loosen strangely. The build goes soft in patches. A thread that looked sound for a few turns suddenly snarls back on itself. Then another from the same marked lot does the same. That is no longer bad luck. It is evidence. You stop one spindle before it can turn a small fault into a larger mess. You lift the package, turn it in your fingers, and feel that familiar unevenness again, but now more consistently than before. Not all bad yarn behaves alike. Some is weak throughout, some has rough places, some carries too much twist and wants to livelly recoil. This lot seems to alternate between firmness and softness, making it hard to hold a steady build. You glance toward the neighboring station. The same marks are there on the delayed basket, so the trouble is shared, not yours alone. A consignment has come into the room with something wrong in its preparation. Maybe the spinning was uneven. Maybe the package was poorly made before reaching winding. Maybe the air on that floor was too damp one day and too dry the next. Cotton is never fully abstract in a mill. It responds to air, friction, handling and storage with stubborn material honesty. What matters in this moment is simpler. If you continue to run that marked lot at ordinary pace, it will steal the whole morning one break at a time. And if the rule does not recognize the pattern soon, more stations may begin losing time for the same reason. So you separate the marked packages into their own row. That act makes the problem visible. Not solved, only visible. And once visible, it asks for a further step. You can keep silent, treat the lot gently, and hope your own sorting is enough. Or you can draw the attention of a jobber or minder, risking irritation for pointing out what everyone else has only half noticed in passing. The room is louder now. The hour is farther on. Your hands are moving faster than when the day began, but your attention has narrowed. One marked package after another proves your suspicion. The trouble is concentrated, and because it is concentrated, it can be managed. If anyone is willing to believe what your fingers already know, you wait until the passing supervisor comes near enough to see without forcing him to stop the whole aisle. Then you hold up one of the marked packages and the soft wound bobbin it produced. Not dramatically, just plainly. A small display of cause and consequence resting in your hands. The supervisor does stop, though only for a breath or two, because even in a noisy room, a clear pattern shown by hand is easier to grasp than a shouted complaint. He presses the soft bobbin once with his thumb, then he looks at the marked package, then at the row you have made apart from the others. That is often how judgment happens in a mill, not by long discussion, but by touching the proof. He does not take the lot away. That would be too simple, and there is too much yarn already waiting behind it. But he gives the small nod that means you may keep it separate, and he says to run those at a slower speed. It is not praise. It is only permission. Still, permission matters. Without it, every pause would look like idleness. With it, the room's delay has a reason attached. You place the marked packages together in their own basket. You leave the better yarn on the main side of the frame, and from then on the work divides in two. One part is ordinary production. The other part is salvage. That difference changes your hands. When the sound lot is running, your movements can settle into a known rhythm. Thread through the guide. Fasten on the tube. Watch the first turns. Let the build take shape. Remove the full bobbin. Set the empty in place. Count one more completed piece. But when the doubtful lot comes forward, every motion shortens. Your hand stays nearer. Your eyes remain on the lay of the thread. You do not trust those packages enough to leave them for even a few moments of divided attention. A weak place may hold for 20 turns, then part without warning. A soft section may seem harmless until the layers beneath it begin to shift. A little extra twist may pull the yarn against itself and make a tiny snarl, the sort that becomes a knot of wasted minutes if not caught early. So the room is one room, yet your station has become two rooms at once. One is manageable. One is uncertain. A bobbin winder learned this kind of split attention because mills were full of mixed conditions. Yarn from one spinning frame might behave well while the next frame's output came in troublesome. One basket of tubes might be smooth and true, another might have chips, rough rinds, or slight crushing from rough handling. There was rarely the luxury of stopping everything and waiting for perfection. Instead, workers sorted, judged, and adapted in place. That did not make the work less skilled. If anything, it made skill harder to notice. Real skill in such a room often looked like calm. The morning advances, the light at the windows has risen now, though it does not brighten the room evenly. Cotton dust softens the air. The glass is marked by use. Sun reaches some boards and leaves others dim. Under the line shafting, the machine-driven rhythm continues with a patience that is not human, and beneath it all, you keep the smaller human rhythm of adjustment. One basket empties, another fills. A row of wound bobbins grows at your side. You count them in small groups, repeating the tally under your breath. 4, then 8, then 12. Not because 12 is a grand number, but because counting in quiet clusters helps prevent the loss that comes when a hand is interrupted, and interruption is always near. The neighboring worker still struggles with the same marked lot. You can hear it in the stop-start changes from her station. Sometimes you reach across and take one more package from her basket, just to keep the floor from filling again. Sometimes she takes one of your completed empties in return. The exchange is practical. No one names it. By late morning, your fingers know the trouble before your eyes do. One package lifts with a certain softness, another unwinds with a faint unwillingness, as if the thread has been laid badly in the earlier stage and is now trying to remember that disorder. Another runs well for several yards, then tightens in a hard little twitch. You begin to recognize the marked lot not only by chalk or tag, but by behavior. That is the sort of knowledge that rarely entered records. A ledger might note a low count, or waste above expectation, or delay in supply to the next room. It would not note the feeling in the fingers when twist changes halfway through a package. It would not note the tiny hesitation before deciding whether to tie and continue, or to put the piece aside and save trouble for later. Yet those small judgments shaped what the mill could do in a day. Bombay's textile mills in the early 20th century were large employers, and often crowded ones. Different departments carried their own rhythms, their own heat, their own dust, and their own forms of strain. Spinning demanded one kind of watchfulness, weaving another. Winding sat in between, preparing yarn so that later work might proceed with fewer interruptions. If winding was careless, weaving felt it. If winding was too slow, downstream rooms waited. It was an in-between trade in every sense, not glamorous, not often described at length, but necessary. The difficult lock proves that again and again as the morning wears on. You finish a bobbin from the suspect basket and press it lightly before setting it with the others. If it feels too soft, it goes into a separate row. If it seems acceptable, though not ideal, it joins the day's usable output. And because the rows must not be mixed, you keep their order almost like a little map. Good lot nearest the main basket. Questionable lot farther left. Rewinding likely needed at the back. Damaged tubes below the frame. Waste ends near your foot, not because they belong there, but because seeing how much is collected helps you remember what this lot has cost. That cost is not only time, it is attention. By now your shoulders have begun to carry the shape of the work. A slight forward bend, arms held ready, fingers dry with lint, eyes moving from spindle to spindle, then down to the baskets, then back up. Standing labor settles into the body in a way sitting labor does not. The tiredness gathers quietly. It starts in the feet, then the calves, then somewhere in the lower back where steadiness and strain meet, but the room does not alter itself for tiredness. The pulleys continue, the belts continue, and so you continue. There is a curious thing about repetitive work under pressure. After enough hours, some motions become easier because they are familiar. Other motions become harder because familiarity can make the mind drift a little too far. That is when mistakes arrive. A thread passed through the wrong guide. A full bobbin set down in the wrong row. A count carried forward incorrectly by one group. The experienced worker protects against that by building order around herself. You have already begun to do this. You repeat counts softly. You keep lots physically apart. You reject bad tubes before they can become mysterious breakages. You clear lint from the guide before it builds into friction. Housekeeping and memory stand very close together here. A cluttered station steals thought. A neat one gives it back. Not all factories respected this truth equally. Some had more room, some had less. Some were strict about arrangement. Some tolerated muddle until it became impossible. In Bombay, as in other industrial centers of the time, crowding was often part of the practical condition of work. A small amount of disorder could become a large amount quickly. So workers developed their own systems, half taught, half learned by long repetition. By the time the meal interval begins to approach, the room has settled into that deep middle state where morning no longer feels fresh, yet afternoon has not begun. The first hurry of arrival is long past. The final push of the day is still ahead. This middle stretch is often where a lot's true character reveals itself. Good yarn keeps proving that it is good. Bad yarn becomes impossible to excuse as chance. And this marked lot has crossed that line. Others in the room have noticed now. You can tell from the glances, from the way one worker checks the marks on a basket before taking from it, from the way another keeps her own doubtful bobbins apart. The problem is no longer private. It is spreading through awareness, if not yet through official action. Still, the machines run. Still, the lot remains in the room. That is the ordinary compromise of industrial work. Recognition does not always bring remedy. Sometimes it brings only a more careful form of endurance. You lift another package. This one has a soft shoulder where the yarn beneath was not built firmly in its earlier stage. As it winds off, that weakness translates into hesitation. The thread does not pull with the same confidence all the way through. You slow the spindle a little, you guide it more closely, it holds, then near the end, the strand parts. You stop, find both ends, tie small, trim close. Begin again. A few minutes later, the bobbin is complete, but not satisfying. Useful, perhaps. Trustworthy enough, perhaps. Still, you mark it in your own mind as one to place among the doubtful. That is another invisible skill in the work, the ability to rank material by confidence. Not merely good or bad, but good, doubtful, barely acceptable, not worth passing on. A mill's official language might be simpler. The hand's language was finer. The meal bell, when it finally comes, does not bring silence so much as a loosening. Some spindles slow, some stop all at once. Voices begin to reappear in the spaces where machine sound eases. The room exhales. You feel the change first as relief in the ears, then in the shoulders, then in the hands which have been holding readiness for hours. You step back from the frame and look at what has gathered there. Rows of finished bobbins. A smaller row of suspect ones. The separate basket of troublesome packages, still not exhausted. Waste ends below. Rejected tubes near your foot. In a few objects, the whole morning can be read. That is one reason mill work so often left traces. Even when words were few, the arrangement of material told a story. You wipe your fingers on a cloth or on the edge of what you wear, though lint clings again almost immediately. Around you, workers reach for tins, cloth-wrapped food, brass water vessels, or whatever they have brought. Some sit where they can, some remain standing, some go out toward a yard or passage if allowed and if there is room. The meal itself is not long and not ceremonial. It is practical nourishment between shifts of attention. A tiffin tin opens with a small metal click. Rice, perhaps some dal, perhaps a little vegetable, pickle or chapati folded from earlier in the morning. The food is familiar. That matters. After hours of lint and oil smell, the scent rising from a tin can feel unexpectedly grounding. You eat with the same economy that shaped the morning. No gesture wasted. No long resting possible. But the body notices the pause. Your feet are grateful for even a short stillness. Your hands uncurl. Your breathing becomes your own again rather than the room's. Conversation, if it comes in pieces. A few words about the lot, a remark about breakages, a complaint too tired to become an argument. Perhaps several languages pass through the same little space. Marathi, Gujarati, Hindi, Konkani, maybe Tamil, maybe something else besides, depending on who has come from where and who stands nearest whom. Bombay's mills drew workers from many backgrounds, and the shop floor often held a practical multilingual life. Meaning could travel through a word, a borrowed phrase, a hand sign, a look at a basket. What everyone understands is delay. What everyone understands is poor yarn. You look, more than once, toward the basket of marked packages left by the frame. There is no comfort in seeing that it has not vanished. No one from another department has taken it away. No clerk has written it off and removed the burden from your station. It waits exactly where you left it. That waiting changes the meal interval. Rest is present, but incomplete. The unfinished work sits in sight. This happened often enough in industrial routine. The break was real, yet never fully detached from the task. You could leave the frame for a few minutes. You could not leave the day's problem behind. When the room begins to gather itself again, the mood is a little heavier, not dramatic. Simply resigned. Workers close tins, stand, brush lint from shawls, sleeves, or the fronts of their clothes. Take one more drink of water, set containers aside, then the machinery resumes its claim. Belts take hold overhead. The familiar note returns to the shafts. One spindle after another comes back into motion, and there, in front of you, the questionable lot is still waiting to be wound. No instruction has come to remove it. Instead, the message passed down is simpler and less comforting. Keep winding. The next department still needs supply. That sentence contains much of mill life. Material must move. Even when its quality is doubtful, even when its handling demands more time than the schedule likes, it must move because other rooms depend on it. A weaving room cannot stop politely while a winding room negotiates perfection. A warping section cannot prepare beams from absence. The whole mill is a chain of imperfect continuities. And now the afternoon begins under that truth. You cannot restart the day from clean conditions. The difficult lot has already entered the work. Some of its bobbins are finished, some are set aside, some remain in packages. From this point onward, the task is not to prevent contamination entirely. It is to keep it legible. That may be the clearest way to describe your role now. You become the person making faults readable. A soft bobbin is not dropped among the sound. A suspect lot is not mixed without mark or memory. A damaged tube is not allowed to disguise itself as a spinning fault. You do not repair everything. You separate what can be used from what may fail later. You leave the next pair of hands some chance to know what happened. This was never a small service in textile work. Cloth passed through many hands, and each hand inherited decisions made earlier. The more visible those decisions remained, the less confusion spread. So you adapt your technique. The better lots can still run at a normal pace, and they must, because output has to exist somewhere in the day. But the marked packages are given slower starts. Sometimes you hold the thread a little longer before trusting it to build. Sometimes you stop after the first layers and press the forming bobbin lightly, checking whether the package beneath is laying evenly. Sometimes you complete the bobbin and then decide it should not join the main count. Each choice is tiny. By afternoon, the day consists almost entirely of such tiny choices. This is the point where an outsider might think the job had become simple drudgery. After all, the actions repeat, the hands follow the same paths, the room makes the same noises. But inside repetition, the level of judgment has increased. It is no longer merely winding, it is sorting, classifying, and forecasting by touch. What will hold? What will catch? What can be passed onward? What must stay behind? One full bobbin from the suspect lot feels firmer than the others. You turn it in your hand. Perhaps this package came from the same marked consignment, but from a better stretch in the spinning. Perhaps the previous operator had steadier conditions for a few minutes. Perhaps it is simple luck. Whatever the reason, you place it among the acceptable, though not without remembering where it came from. That memory matters because later, if numbers are questioned or faults reported from the next room, you may need to retrace the day through objects. This basket, that row, those marked pieces. The work trains memory by necessity, not book memory. spatial memory, material memory. The memory of where a thing was placed and why. Around you, the afternoon thickens. Heat rises a little. The air seems fuller, though perhaps that is only your body growing more tired within it. Lint clings at the wrists. It settles in folds of cloth. It catches at the hairline. Workers in cotton mills often carried the room with them physically, even after leaving it. A little white in the cuff, a faint film on the skin. The smell of oil and fiber not fully gone by evening. Inside the room, those details become ordinary. You notice them only at certain moments, when pausing to drink, or to wipe your face, or to shake out a bit of waste from the hem of a garment. The neighboring station has steadied somewhat, mostly because the burden has been shared and the method changed. That, too, is a kind of evidence. The lot was not impossible, it was simply unforgiving of haste. Such distinctions mattered to workers more than to reports. A foreman might ask why count fell, a jobber might note that the material was poor, but the hand knew whether poor meant unusable or merely slow. And slow could still be workable, if everyone accepted the cost. The difficulty is that mills did not always welcome slowness, even when slowness prevented larger losses. You begin to feel that tension now. A clerk or overseer comes along the aisle asking for numbers. Not angrily, not softly either. He wants to know what each station has produced, what remains, and why one area of the room still looks more burdened than the others. There is no point answering with long explanation over the machine sound. So you answer with arrangement. You show the neat rows of completed bobbins. You indicate the separate suspect batch. You point, briefly, to the marked packages still waiting. Order becomes your argument. This is one of the quiet dignities of such work. When speech carries poorly, material can speak. The overseer's eyes move over what you have done. He sees that the delayed station is not simply idle. He sees that some output has continued. He sees that the troublesome lot has been kept apart rather than hidden inside the main count. Again, no praise follows, but neither does he sweep the rows together or force all of it onward without distinction. He lets the method stand. That is enough for now. Trust in a mill could be thin and practical. Often it meant only that one would be allowed to go on doing what seemed to be holding the day together, so the afternoon enters its longest stretch. This is when fatigue changes texture. Morning tiredness is mostly physical awakening into labor. Afternoon tiredness is more complete. The feet have lost freshness. The back has accepted strain. The eyes are not sharp in the same way. And still the yarn asks to be judged. This is where repetition can become almost meditative, though never quite restful. Your hands continue. Empty tube. Thread. Guide. Start. Watch. Stop. Tie. Restart. Remove. Set aside. Count. Again. Again. The rhythm is steady enough to hold you, but not so simple that you can disappear into it entirely. Every few minutes, the suspect lot demands fresh attention and brings you back. One package slips badly at the source and collapses into a little snarl before the thread can draw cleanly away. You stop at once. Untangle what can be untangled. Discard what has become too knotted. There is waste now, more than you would like. Each wasted length is small in itself. Together they form a visible tuft near your feet. Waste in textile work had many causes and was often watched closely because it represented material paid for but not carried forward into cloth. Yet not all waste was equal. Some waste prevented greater trouble. A few discarded yards could save repeated loom stoppages later. This is the quiet arithmetic of practical labor. The person nearest the material often understood it best. A little later, another package from the same lot behaves better than expected. It runs almost smoothly through half its length. Then, near the end, a hard twist catches and jerks the thread sideways. You hear it in the sound before you fully see it. That ability to hear trouble is one of the room's most intimate skills. The machinery is noisy, yes, but it is also patterned. Within that pattern, your ear begins to sort one note from another until a snag announces itself almost like a cough in a familiar voice. You stop the spindle before the twist can pull a loop across the forming layers. The thread has not broken this time, it has only turned against itself, making a tiny hard place that would bury badly if allowed to pass. You pinch it, ease it free, and let the package unwind a little by hand. That small rescue takes only moments, but the moments add up, and by now you can feel the whole afternoon being measured in such rescues. A worker who did this every day learned to hear not only speed, but strain. A clean running spindle kept a thin, even whisper. A bobbin building too soft sounded duller, almost padded. A thread dragging through a rough guide gave a faint, dry scrape, and a package with uneven twist announced itself in little interruptions, tiny catches that tugged at the ear before they reached the eye. That was why winding could never be called mindless, though people often called it simple. The mind was in the listening. It was in the memory of how a sound should be. It was in the instant decision to stop one spindle and let another run a few breaths longer. You make that decision again and again now. One hand reaches to a spindle that needs slowing. The other clears an end, or lifts a full bobbin, or finds an empty tube that is still sound. At your feet, the rows remain clear, because without those rows, the afternoon would dissolve into uncertainty. Good bobbins nearest your stronger side, doubtful ones apart, those meant for rewinding farther back, where they cannot be mixed by mistake. The arrangement has become almost a second pair of hands. When the body grows more tired, order does some of the thinking for you. This is one of the quiet truths of factory work. A worker often built calm from placement. A basket moved 6 inches to the left might save 20 unnecessary motions in an hour. A separate pile for damaged tubes might prevent a dozen false breakages. A repeated count, spoken under the breath, might hold the whole station together when noise threatens to scatter thought. You count again now, softly, and then once more to be sure. Not because the numbers are grand, but because one missing bobbin at day's end can send memory searching backward through an entire shift. The tally must live somewhere before it reaches paper. Until someone writes it down, it lives in your mouth, your hands, and the shape of the rows. The clerk's passing question has left its trace. Even after he moves on, you remain aware that the station must continue to justify itself. That is another kind of pressure, not sharp enough to make drama, but constant enough to narrow the chest. The room wants proof that care is not laziness. It wants visible result, so you keep the rows even. You do not let suspect packages creep unnoticed into the main count. You do not hide the waste under the frame where it cannot be seen. If there is delay, you let the material explain it. That is safer than argument. In many mills of the period, argument traveled badly upward. Evidence traveled better. A floor full of snarled ends. A basket marked from one lot, all misbehaving alike. A line of acceptable bobbins beside a line of soft ones. These things could be seen, touched, and passed along. Words might be doubted. Cotton, once wound badly enough, was harder to dispute. Bombay's textile industry by the early 20th century depended on exactly this sort of ordinary rescue work. Large mills could be described in statistics, spindle counts, loom counts, wages, strikes, exports, bales received. But between those measurements lived the hidden labor of keeping irregular material moving without letting disorder spread too far. The bobbin winder stood at one of those quiet junctions. Not at the beginning of the process, where raw cotton first entered, not at the end, where cloth appeared in visible lengths, but in the middle, where continuity was made by hand. That middle place could be tiring in a special way. You were close enough to earlier faults to inherit them. You were also close enough to later departments to know that your own mistakes would travel. A spinner's uneven twist became your stoppage. Your loose build became a weaver's broken pick, or a warper's irritation, or another worker's delayed count. The work taught a practical morality of passing things onward. Not perfect, because perfection was rarely available, but understandable, workable, honest in its condition. So, when another doubtful bobbin comes off, you turn it once in your palm and decide it should not leave with the main lot. The build looks regular enough at first glance, but your fingers feel what the eye might miss, a slight give in the middle layers, Not enough to collapse now, but enough to cause trouble when unwound later under tension. You set it into the separate row. That one choice saves no time in the present hour. If anything, it loses time. Yet it protects the order of the afternoon, and perhaps the order of another room. This was the sort of judgment that made the job more than speed. A less careful worker might count everything finished as equal, but finished was not equal to fit. The shift has moved well past the meal interval now. The room's heat is steadier. Even the shafts overhead seem to have settled into a heavier hum, though perhaps that is only how they sound when the day has grown old in your ears. The light at the windows has shifted. Dust is visible where it crosses through it, though not in a dramatic beam, only enough to soften outlines. Your own shadow, when you catch it on the floorboards, looks faint and frayed around the edges by lint. You pause once to flex your fingers. The joints notice the work before the muscles complain. Small, repeated pinches, small, repeated ties, small, repeated lifts. They gather in the knuckles. Then you return at once to the frame because pauses are never fully free here. There is always a spindle nearly ready to fill, a package nearly ready to misbehave, a count nearly ready to be lost. The neighboring station calls your attention again without speaking. A basket has shifted. Not badly this time, only enough to show that their own separate row is beginning to form as yours has. In a room like this, methods spread sideways. One worker sees that another's arrangement prevents confusion, and a similar arrangement appears nearby by the next hour. No instruction book is needed. Practical order is contagious when it works. You glance and notice the same marks on some of her remaining packages. So the difficult lot is still not exhausted there either. The afternoon is longer than the better material lasted. That, too, alters the tone of the work. At first, bad yarn may feel like an inconvenience limited to one basket. Later, when it persists, it becomes the condition of the day. You stop thinking of getting through it quickly. You begin thinking of surviving it cleanly. That change is quiet, but important. It turns impatience into method, and method is easier to carry for long hours than frustration. You settle further into the system you have made. Good lot to the right, marked lot to the left, completed sound bobbins in pairs, doubtful ones in shorter groups so they stand out at once, waste collected where it can be judged, not hidden. Rejected tubes set mouth up so a quick glance shows how many there are. Each placement stores information. Each little pattern keeps one more fact from slipping away. This is why the work can look repetitive from a distance and feel intricate from within. The same motions repeat, yes, but the reasons behind them multiply. One tube is replaced because it is full, another because its lip is rough. One spindle is stopped because the package has finished, another because the tension has changed. One bobbin joins the count, another is held back, though it took the same labor to make. Outsiders might see only hands moving in rows. The worker sees categories, exceptions, and consequences. A little later, the overseer returns with someone from further along the floor, perhaps a clerk, perhaps a jobber from a neighboring section. The exact title matters less than the fact of a second pair of eyes. They are not here for ceremony. The day is too advanced for that. They want to know whether the delayed output can still be sent onward in useful quantity. Again, speech must be brief. You indicate the rows. You show which are from the marked lot. You show which should probably be rewound. One of them picks up a doubtful bobbin and presses it, then another. The comparison is immediate. A sound package resists with a certain firmness. The soft one yields slightly under the thumb. No one needs a lecture after that. Cotton, wound one way or another, explains itself well. The discussion, such as it is, comes in fragments. A few words, a glance toward the basket of marked packages, a remark about keeping them apart, a decision that some of the softer ones may have to stay back. Nothing is solved in a grand sense. There is no dramatic clearing of the floor. The lot is still there. The shift is still running, but now the burden is at least named by more than one person. That matters. Named trouble can be sorted. Unnamed trouble spreads. They move on. You keep working. The permission remains what it was before. Continue, but continue in a way that leaves the problem visible. That is enough to shape the next hour. You no longer feel compelled to disguise caution as speed. You can let the good yarn run and check the bad yarn by hand where needed. The station becomes, more openly now, a place of selection. One bobbin for use, one for doubt, one for later attention. The next room will still want numbers, but now there is a stronger chance that the doubtful material will not travel unlabeled. This is the kind of modest success that fills many industrial days. Not triumph, not relief, only a slightly better arrangement of difficulty. And often that was what made the difference between a workable shift and a disorderly one. You notice too how fatigue can make memory slippery unless anchored by repetition. So the counts are spoken more often now. Not loudly, just enough that the number settles in the mouth. 4 sound, 2 doubtful, 3 more sound, 1 held back, then the larger total repeated, then repeated again after the next interruption. Counting becomes less arithmetic than rhythm. It gives the mind a rail to hold. The body appreciates rails in the late afternoon. By this point, the standing has become part of everything. Your feet no longer hurt in distinct places. They ache as a whole. The boards under them have a feel you know too well. Dry, slightly dusty, firm in some spots, faintly trembling where machine motion reaches through the frame. When you shift your weight, the relief is slight but grateful. One heel, then the other. A small bend in the knee, then back to steady posture. Many kinds of labor leave their mark in obvious exertion. This kind leaves it in duration. Long hours of attention, long hours upright, long hours making the same motions carefully enough that they remain worth doing. There is something almost domestic in that steadiness, though the setting is industrial. You keep things in place. You wipe away what catches, you sort what belongs where. You notice the small change before it becomes a larger inconvenience. Housework and factory work were not the same, of course. One belonged to the mill, one to the home. One was waged, however lightly, the other was often expected without pay. Yet certain forms of skill crossed between them, the habit of order, the conservation of usable things, the memory of where items had been put, the patience to repeat necessary motions without making them careless. In Bombay's mills, many women brought such habits into wage work, and the mill relied on them even when official descriptions did not dwell on them. If you read ledgers or annual reports, you might find categories of labor and numbers of hands. You would find less often the texture of what those hands knew. The winding room kept some of that knowledge hidden in plain sight. A worker learned to tell yarn count by handling, to know whether a bobbin was firm enough before sending it onward, to spot a damaged tube before it cut a thread repeatedly and made the fault appear mysterious, to hear a rough guide, to remember which basket belonged to which lot. These were not abstract accomplishments. They were practical safeguards against wasted hours. Another package from the marked lot comes to hand. This one shows its trouble early. The yarn comes away in little uneven draws, too tight for a moment, then oddly loose. You do not even try to run it at ordinary pace. Instead, you begin by hand, letting only a modest speed take hold. The first layers lie better that way. Not perfect, but less likely to bury a weakness immediately. As it builds, you keep one finger near the running line, feeling the slight change in pull. This is a dangerous place to romanticize, so it is better to say it plainly. The work is tiring, repetitive, and badly rewarded by comfort. Yet it also asks a nearness to material that many forms of work never offer. You know cotton not as a distant commodity, but as resistance between fingertips, as lint caught against the skin, as twist, softness, drag, and release, as a thing that behaves differently in different air, under different handling, from different frames. That intimacy is part of the labor. And because it is intimate, it is often overlooked by people who see only the larger machine. The bobbin fills. Near the final third, the package steadies somewhat. You allow a touch more speed, then a soft patch passes. The new layers sink more than they should. You stop, press the surface, consider, then decide to finish it, but mark it doubtful. That is the day's method in miniature. Not ideal material, not wholly useless. Made serviceable by caution and still not entirely trusted. More and more, the afternoon feels built from such compromises. The neighboring worker borrows one of your sound empties and gives a look of thanks too brief to call a conversation. You take one of her marked packages in exchange when you have a breathing space. Shared trouble often produces these little economies. They are not written into management schemes. They simply happen where two stations are close enough that one person's order helps the other. In crowded workrooms, mutual adjustment could be as necessary as supervision. Not because everyone was sentimental, but because stoppage spread. A blocked floor, a mixed set of baskets, a lost tally. These inconveniences moved outward quickly. Cooperation was often practical before it was kind. Still, practicality has its own warmth. As the hour draws onward, the room's noise becomes less something you hear and more something you inhabit. The hum settles into the bones. Voices, when they appear, seem to rise out of it rather than interrupt it. A dropped tube makes a brief sharper note, then the old pattern closes around it. A call from the aisle comes and goes, the shafts continue. The belts continue, and among all of that, your own little working world remains organized by touch. You begin to think ahead toward the count-out at the end of the shift, not because the end is near enough to relax into, but because the arrangement now will determine whether the final tally can be trusted. This is the stage where foresight matters. A careless station can always be made to look busy in the moment. It is harder to make it understandable at closing time. You want the totals to explain themselves. If the difficult lot comes in short, there should be the separate row to show why. If rewinding is needed, those bobbins should already be apart. If output from the neighboring station was partly absorbed here, you must be able to point to where and when that happened. Memory alone is too fragile after a full day. Objects must carry some of it, so you begin grouping the finished bobbins more deliberately. The accepted ones go in sets you can count by touch as well as sight. The doubtful ones stay in smaller clusters. The rewind row remains thin but distinct. The waste beneath the frame is gathered into a visible little twist instead of many scattered threads. Even the basket of rejected tubes is nudged into better alignment. This is not vanity. It is preparation for being questioned later. The mills of Bombay in this period, large as they were, often ran on a combination of rigid systems and human patching. There were timekeepers, clerks, overlookers, jobbers, and department heads. There were rules about attendance, output, waste, and conduct. Yet the actual movement of material from one room to the next still depended heavily on workers making conditions legible. Factories could count many things, but they still needed someone to point and say, "This lot is the slow one. These packages are the doubtful ones." That count includes the pieces I took from next door when their floor space vanished. Without such translation, numbers blurred. And blur in a mill could become accusation very quickly. You are aware of that, even if no one says it aloud. A short count can look like idleness if the evidence is messy. A short count can look like careful salvage if the evidence is clear. So you keep making the evidence clear. Another run finishes cleanly. Good lot, smooth build, no break. That feels almost luxurious after so many troublesome packages. You set the bobbin down with a small satisfaction. These moments matter more in repetitive work than outsiders might expect. Not because they are dramatic, because they reassure the hands that the method still works. A sound package winding cleanly restores proportion. The whole day is not broken, only parts of it are. Then a marked package follows and reminds you at once why the rows are necessary. It frays very slightly near the start, not enough to part, but enough to roughen the line. You stop, inspect the guide, inspect the tube, and find neither at fault. So the trouble belongs to the yarn itself. That certainty is useful. Cause located, Not solved, but located. You continue gently. The bobbin reaches a passable finish, not one to admire, only one to classify. Passable work filled many industrial hours. There was less clean perfection than people imagine. More often, there was gradation. Best, usable, doubtful, reject. The bobbin winder lived among gradations. Perhaps that is why the work trained such close judgment. When everything is excellent, little sorting is required. When much is mixed, the sorter becomes essential. The afternoon has become a long act of sorting. Not only yarn, but trust. Not only material, but time. Which stoppage is worth preventing. Which package can be accepted with caution. Which can only be delayed. Which count must be remembered now before another interruption wipes it away. A bell from elsewhere in the mill carries faintly through the larger noise. Not yours. Another department, marking another phase of its day. That reminds you how many linked routines occupy the same building. Somewhere, spinning continues. Somewhere, looms take in what winding sends. Somewhere, a clerk enters figures that flatten all this textured labor into columns. And here, in between, you keep deciding what shape those figures can honestly take. The difficult lot is smaller now. That should feel like relief. Instead, it brings a different concern. The end of a bad batch is often where counts become uncertain. Loose remaining packages are easier to misplace. Half-finished pieces are easier to forget. Substitutions made during the crowded middle hours return in memory asking to be accounted for. You look at the basket and can tell there are fewer marked packages left. But fewer does not mean simple. Some of the last ones are the most troublesome because they were set aside earlier for good reason. Now they must either be attempted or left plainly untouched. You choose one of those earlier set-asides. At once your fingers remember why it was postponed. The build from the previous stage is poor. The yarn lies irregularly, making the unwinding awkward from the start. It slubs against itself before the first clean draw has settled, and you can feel the trouble traveling backwards into your hand. You don't force it. You let the spindle take only a little, then stop, then a little more, almost teaching the thread how to leave its old package without tearing itself apart. This is slower than winding ought to be, and slower than anyone would choose on an easy day. But by now, the day is no longer divided into easy and hard. It is divided into what can be sent onward and what must be understood before it moves. You ease away a crossed turn with your thumbnail. A few loose fibers cling there, pale against the darker oil-polished wood of the frame. The package gives another reluctant jerk. Then it steadies. For a short while at least, you keep your face turned slightly toward the running thread. Not because there is anything to see in every instant, but because this kind of work uses watching the way some people use listening. A small tremor in the line, a change in the way the layers sit, a little sideways pull where the yarn should be true. Those are enough. You stop again before the line can knot. Another worker might have let this one break and tied it after. Sometimes that was the quicker course. But this package has already proved that once it tangles, it wastes not 1 minute, but several. So prevention, here, is cheaper than repair. You lift the partly filled bobbin and press it lightly. The build is uneven, though not beyond saving. A softer middle, a firmer shoulder. Not elegant, but perhaps passable if kept apart, and clearly remembered. You finish it, then place it not with the main count, not with the full rejects either, but in that narrower row of things that may go only if the room has no better answer. That middle row has become the true record of the afternoon. Not success, not failure, compromise. And as the light outside the windows begins to lean toward evening, compromise becomes the main skill left. The room does not grow quieter yet, but it grows more aware of time. You can hear that change in the handling of baskets, in the way finished bobbins are no longer simply set down, but grouped. In the way workers begin to look, every so often not just at the spindle in front of them, but at the total shape of what remains. The end of a shift often begins before the machine's slow. It begins in the counting. You start that count early because you must. The accepted row is gathered into neat lots. The doubtful row is checked once more by hand. The softest packages are pressed, turned, and judged again in light of what supply is still needed. A bobbin that would have been held back at midday might now be accepted if it is firm enough and plainly marked by memory. Another, made only an hour ago, might be set aside because there is no honest way to trust it. This was one of the quieter pressures at day's end. Standards did not vanish, but they had to live alongside need. Bombay's mills worked to feed looms, contracts, merchants, schedules, and wages. No department existed in a vacuum. If winding starved weaving entirely, that had consequences. If winding sent forward a run of soft or badly built bobbins, that too had consequences. So the final hours of the day often involved a practical negotiation between quantity and condition, not spoken as philosophy, handled as material. You take up another of the troublesome final packages and find, with some relief, that this one is better. Not good in the confident way of the morning sound yarn, but orderly enough to make progress. The thread draws more evenly. The layers lie down with less argument. You let the spindle run a little longer before intervening. That small gift of smooth running feels almost luxurious now. It lets your shoulders lower. It lets your count move without interruption. One more complete, then another. The accepted row begins to thicken again. Not quickly. Still, visibly invisible progress matters late in the day. It changes how the station feels. It tells the body that the long labor has not dissolved into pure correction and waste. There is product here. There are rows to show for the hours. There is enough order that the room may yet close without confusion. A clerk comes back once more. This time his interest is not in the broad question of delay, but in the narrower question of totals. What can be taken? What must remain? What count should be attached to this station's work when the floor settles? You answer by moving the rows closer together. Accepted here, rewind there. The neighboring station's borrowed portion indicated by memory and by the basket you kept separate. These distinctions are not merely defensive now. They are how the next department avoids inheriting mystery. If a bundle goes forward, someone should know what kind of bundle it is. If a short count is entered, someone should know where it thinned out. The clerk touches 2 packages from the doubtful row. His hand repeats what yours has been saying for hours. One is too soft. One is firm enough if unwound carefully. He nods once. That one small nod turns into a practical outcome. The firmer doubtful pieces may pass, but not mixed invisibly with the better lot. The softest remain. There will be rewinding tomorrow, or later, or by some hand still not off shift. No speech of apology, no speech of blame, only a sorting of futures. This bobbin goes on, this one waits. Textile work was full of such handoffs. Not every problem could be solved where it first appeared. Often the best a worker could do was keep the problem attached to its object, instead of letting it disappear into general disorder. You feel that clearly now as you gather the accepted pieces into their delivery group. The row has a look to it that only you may notice. Slight differences in shape, slight differences in firmness. The memory of where each came from. A package from the sound lot, another from the suspect lot but managed carefully, one from the neighboring station's burden, one from your own difficult basket. On paper, they may become a number. In your hands they remain a day's map. At the floor by your feet, the waste tells a second story. There is more than there should have been on a clean day. Not outrageous. Not enough to halt the room. Still, enough that the eye understands what the fingers already know. Repeated breaks, ends tied close, short lengths discarded because they would only cause worse trouble if kept. You gather that waste more neatly now. Not to hide it. To count it with a glance. A surprising amount of factory truth could be read from what was left on the floor. A worker's haste, a bad lot's stubbornness, a rough tube's hidden damage. A guide clogged by lint. By evening, the residue of the day arranged itself almost like evidence after a rainless storm. You bend once, straighten slowly, and feel the pull along the lower back. The shift has been written there too. Textile labor, especially standing labor, had a way of collecting itself in the body not all at once, but in layers. The feet bore the first part, the back took the next. The hands held the finest account. Small stiffness at the knuckles, a dry pinch at the fingertips, sometimes a little burn where a thread had run fast across the skin. Nothing dramatic, just accumulation. The neighboring worker is doing her own count now. You can see from the angle of her shoulders that she too is retracing the day through objects. She touches one row, then another, checks a basket, finds a half-used tube, looks briefly at the floor where waste has gathered under her frame. That was common at day's end. The mind walked backward through the shift by looking at what remained. It had to. No one carried every event in clear order after so many hours of repetition and interruption. Objects remembered for you, the marked baskets, the rejected tubes, the separate row of soft packages, the incomplete package left because there was no time or no honest way to finish it well. That incomplete package now sits near your station's edge. You look at it and decide not to attempt one more rescue. That choice matters. Late in the shift, pride can tempt a worker into starting what should be left untouched. But an unfinished salvage begun too near closing only creates a worse puzzle for the next person. Better to leave one difficult package plainly aside than to leave half a doubtful bobbin with no clear account of its state. So you set it with the holdbacks, untouched enough to be recognized, not mixed with finished work, not hidden among waste, just left where its condition can still be read. There is dignity in that kind of restraint. Industrial labor is often imagined as constant motion, but some of its best judgments are refusals. Not this one. Not today. Not in this condition. The shafts overhead continue. The room is still in work. But the mood has shifted further toward reckoning. More workers are grouping and tying off. More baskets are being straightened. A few voices rise slightly as machine noise ebbs at one end of the floor, where stopping has begun sooner. The winding room has its own twilight before any lamp is dimmed. A lessening of active trouble, a gathering of what has been produced, a return from process to record. You begin recounting from the beginning of your accepted row, touching each bobbin in pairs. 2, then 4, then 6. You stop once when memory flickers around whether one from the neighboring load was already included. So you start that subset again. This is not carelessness. This is what a long day does. It softens the edge of certainty, especially when the work has involved substitutions, borrowed baskets, altered pace, and separate classes of product all at once. That is why skilled workers relied on arrangement as much as recollection. The row itself helps you think. The spacing helps you remember. The very fact that one group is a hand's width from the next carries information back into the tired mind. You finish the accepted count, then the doubtful count, then the firm doubtful that may pass if noted, then the true holdbacks. Each total settles in your mouth before it reaches another ear. You repeat them once under your breath. Again, again. A wrong number, spoken in fatigue, can cling stubbornly. So you give yourself the chance to hear it right before anyone asks. The clerk returns for the final taking. He has his own weariness by now. One can see it in the shortness of his questions, though not in an unkind way. The day has used everyone differently. He asks the total. You give the accepted count first, then the separated count, then the pieces to remain. He checks by eye, then by touch for the doubtful lot. There is no theatrical dispute. The rows are too clear for that. Still, one small mismatch appears, not in the accepted row itself, but in the expectation attached to the marked lot. There should have been one more completed package from that basket, according to what came in, or else one fewer package should remain half used. The difference is small. One package only. Yet at this hour, small differences matter. They are the sort that later become larger confusions, so the day narrows, for a little while, into that modest problem. Where did the count slip? Was a piece moved to the neighboring station and never returned in memory? Was one doubtful package counted among holdbacks twice? Did one of the late salvages consume more of a source package than expected and leave too little to finish? These are not heroic questions. They are the true questions of closing time. You retrace the afternoon through the physical signs, the marked basket, the borrowed load, the row of rewinds, the incomplete package you wisely left untouched. Then your eye falls to the waste gathered beneath the frame. A little more lies there than the count in your head had allowed for. Not enough to make a speech over, enough to explain a shortage of one. That is likely where it went. Not stolen by carelessness, consumed in the repeated rescue of a poor package, in the lengths cut away after snarls, in the frayed sections you refused to bury into a bobbin that had to travel on. The clerk looks down too. He does not need every detail. The waste, the half-used remains and the separated rows tell enough. So the short count is entered as short, and the reason remains attached to visible material. That is the best outcome available. Not a corrected total, an honest one. There is a kind of relief in that. Not pleasure, exactly. Just the easing that comes when confusion has been prevented from pretending to be success. You have not hidden the loss. You have translated it. And in factory work, translation was often one of the most useful forms of skill. Some bobbins are lifted away now for the next department, others remain. The holdbacks stay near the frame, not abandoned, but assigned to another round of attention when there is time, or another shift, or another worker. The accepted group leaves with the day attached to it only in memory. Soon it will be only material again in someone else's hands. That was always part of the strangeness of industrial labor. Hours of close judgment could disappear into a row of ordinary-looking objects. A weaver receiving these bobbins later might know only that some run a little less smoothly than others. A warper might detect the softer build in one stretch and wonder briefly at the winding room. The full story seldom travelled complete. Most labour passed onward stripped of narrative. Only the object remained. That is why these closing arrangements matter. They are the last chance to make the object speak a little for itself. The floor begins to lose tension as more machines ease down. Not all at once, a section first, then another. The shafting's long hum develops gaps. In those gaps, small sounds emerge that had been hidden all day. A tube set gently into a basket, a cloth shaken out, a cough, the scrape of a shoe against the boards. The room, after many hours of continuous mechanical voice, seems to rediscover human scale. You stand for a moment without moving your hands and feel the ringing at the edge of hearing. Mill workers often carried that ringing with them into the street. The body does not stop when the belt stops. It keeps a little of the machine's rhythm inside. Your own hands still feel ready to catch an end, to guide a line, to stop a spindle that is no longer running. That is another residue of repetition. The action continues in the nerves after the need has gone. You begin the final tidying of the station. Empty tubes are returned where they belong. The damaged ones stay apart. Waste is gathered. The partly used, marked packages are left in their separate basket, not because they are special in any proud sense, but because tomorrow they must not be mistaken for sound stock. You wipe the frame where cotton dust has settled thickest near your working hand. The cloth comes away pale, then pale again on the second pass. No workshop handling fiber is ever truly cleaned in a single motion. It is only reduced to order. That phrase could describe the whole day. Reduced to order, not perfected, not redeemed from all irregularity. Just brought into a shape that the next person can work with. You look once more at the accepted bundles already gone, then at the holdback still near you. The division has a moral feel to it, though it comes from practice rather than grand principle. These may go. These should wait. That kind of honesty was a hidden foundation of many factories. Without it, every room merely pushed its confusion downstream. With it, production remained imperfect but possible. The neighboring worker has finished her own arrangement and is brushing lint from the front of her clothes with short, quick strokes. The lint rises, catches the dim light, and settles elsewhere. That, too, is part of cotton work. Nothing fully leaves. It moves. From basket to bobbin, from frame to floor, from cloth to skin, from room to street. Many workers in Bombay's mills must have gone home carrying a little white at the cuffs or collar, the day's labour visible only to anyone near enough to notice. The room now is quieter by degrees. A few late spindles still turn. One last check is made by the aisle. A number is called softly and answered. Then another machine slows. The difference in sound is immediate and gentle. Without the constant turning, the building itself seems larger. You become aware again of the windows, of the warmer smell that machinery had masked beneath oil and cotton, of your own breathing. The station before you, so active all day, turns back into wood, iron, baskets, and arranged things. Objects at rest reveal the care they have required. The polished groove where hands have worked for years. The nicked edge of a tube set aside from use. The little hollow under the frame where waste gathered. The neat row of holdbacks waiting like unfinished thoughts. You flex your fingers one more time. There is stiffness there now that the work no longer covers with motion. You rub thumb across forefinger and can still feel an imagined thread between them. That sensation often lingers after repetitive hand labor. The task goes on in the body by echo. The same is true of sound. Even in this relative quiet, your ear still half expects the faint change that means a breakage. It takes a little while to believe the need to react has ended. The doors toward the yard let in a changed air when they open. Not cool exactly, not in Bombay's climate, but different from the room's used warmth. A more spacious air, street air. Evening air with dust of another kind in it. Workers begin to drift toward it in the practical order of people too tired for ceremony. No one glides out of a mill in romance. One gathers one's things, checks that one's station is left intelligible, returns what belongs returned, then goes. You do the same. The last damaged tube is left where it can be counted. The cloth used to wipe the frame is folded away. Any small personal item set aside during the meal break is collected again. The body, after so many hours stationed in one patch of floor, feels oddly uncertain in the first free steps. That happens with repetitive standing work. Movement returns, but not at once in comfort. The feet seem to remember the boards they have left. You take a last glance at the basket of difficult remnants. It is smaller now. That much is true. But it is not empty. Some of the day's problem has gone onward, sorted as well as possible. Some of it remains for tomorrow or another hand. That unresolved ending is ordinary. Factories rarely finished all their questions by evening. They only redistributed them. As you move out with the others, the corridor or stair has its own layer of lint and smell. Not as thick as the room, still enough to mark the trade. Voices are a little easier now. Short exchanges become possible without leaning close or shouting over shafting. Someone remarks on the lot, someone else on the count, another on the heat. These are not conversations seeking revelation. They are the brief, practical speech of people stepping out of work while still partly inside it. Bombay outside the mill does not feel silent, but it feels varied. The city holds wheels, feet, coals, carts, tram bells in some districts, hawkers, and the ordinary evening stir of a large port town living many lives at once. After hours in a room where one sound ruled, this variety can feel almost soft. The sky has changed while you were standing at the frame. That often happened in long shifts. The day outside moved as surely as the yarn, but you saw it only by slivers through dusty panes. Now the broader evening light finds the lint on sleeves and in the cuffs. It finds the tiredness in the shoulders too. You brush at one sleeve and raise a little cloud of white that vanishes in the air. Still some remains. There is always more. The route away from the mill is shared by many whose jobs touch different parts of the same process. Spinners, weavers, carders, fitters, sweepers, jobbers, clerks carrying the day's figures in their heads until they can reach a desk. The mill lets them out separately, but the trade ties them together, one room handing its burden to the next. And as you walk, you can feel more clearly what your own part has been. Not spinning the cotton from its loose beginning, not weaving it into cloth, only taking what arrived imperfectly and giving it onward in the best order you could manage. That sounds small when said quickly. It did not feel small at the frame. A badly wounded bobbin could travel far before its fault became visible. A soft build might hold through winding, then loosen in warping. A buried weak place might pass into weaving and break there, under another worker's hand, at another hour, in another room that had never seen the marked basket where the trouble began. So even outside the gate, the day's unresolved thread is still with you. It has simply changed form. Inside the winding room, it was a set of packages, rows, and stoppages. Out here, it becomes a question that has not yet reached its next answer. Will the firmer, doubtful bobbins run cleanly enough? Will the softer ones held back be rewound tomorrow, or set aside again if some fresh trouble arrives first? Will the next department curse the lot, or merely slow for it and move on? A great deal of industrial work ended like that, not with completion, but with transfer. Bombay's mills by the 1910s were large enough to seem almost self-moving from a distance. Tall chimneys, long sheds, thousands of spindles, accounts measured in bales, hanks, wages, and shipments. Yet when you come close to a single day, the whole system narrows into these hand-sized uncertainties. One package too soft, one count entered short by honest waste, one worker deciding not to hide a doubtful row among the sound. Those decisions did not make headlines. Still, they helped determine whether the next room inherited order or confusion. The street takes some of the lint from you as you walk, though not all. The body keeps its own residue. There is the faint ache in the calves, the lower back, dull now, no longer masked by motion. The fingertips, which still feel as if thread is passing between them. And there is the sound. Even with the city around you, some part of the ear continues listening for the little catch of a spindle in trouble. That often happened after long hours around machinery. The room came home by echo. Workers in cotton mills learned to live with that quiet aftersound. Not every source from the time dwells on it, but memoirs, inquiries, and later recollections all circle similar truths. The noise stayed in the head, the dust stayed in the clothes, and the motions stayed for a while in the hands. For women in the winding rooms, and for many men and boys in neighboring departments, the working day did not simply stop at the gate. Its marks moved outward, onto food eaten later, onto sleep, onto the next morning's rising before full light. A bobbin winder's labor sat low in the hierarchy of description, but not low in consequence. That is one reason the work can feel almost hidden in history. Factory records often tell you how many hands were employed. Inspectors might note ventilation, hours, wages, child labor accidents, or the broad organization of departments. Trade writing might discuss yarn counts, spindleage, or export conditions. But the ordinary skill of a worker standing at a winding frame, deciding by touch what could pass and what should wait, survives mostly in fragments. A line in a report, a passing mention in a memoir, a technical note in a textile manual that assumes the hands already know what the sentence means. So, if you linger here, at the end of an ordinary shift, you begin to see how much had to be known without being celebrated. You had to recognize uneven twist before it became repeated breakage. You had to distrust a damaged tube by the feel of its lip. You had to keep lots apart physically, because memory alone could not survive a noisy day full of interruptions. You had to count while doing. You had to listen while counting. And sometimes, as today, you had to become the last filter in the room, because the material had arrived already carrying trouble from somewhere earlier in the chain. That burden was common in mills. Each department inherited more than material. It inherited the quality of the attention that came before. If carding was poor, spinning suffered. If spinning was uneven, winding slowed. If winding disguised faults, weaving paid. That interdependence made factory labor feel both narrow and wide. Narrow because your own station was small, your actions repetitive, your line of sight limited to a frame, a few baskets, a patch of floor. Wide because what you did there could reach into another room you might never enter. You see that clearly now in the evening because the accepted bobbins are already gone from your hands. Soon they will be only part of someone else's ordinary difficulty. There is something almost tender in that thought, though it is not sentimental. Work passes from person to person without carrying all its explanations. One hand prepares for the next seldom knows the whole story. That was true in Bombay's mills, as in so many industrial systems, and it gave special weight to the small act of leaving things understandable. When you kept the soft bobbins apart, you were not only protecting a tally, you were showing respect to a future worker you might never meet. When you reported the short count instead of smoothing it over, you were doing the same, not making the day prettier than it was, making it legible. That may be the quiet dignity at the center of this job. Not heroism, not mastery over every difficulty, only the refusal to turn confusion into someone else's invisible burden. The evening thickens. Shops and cooking fires, carts and voices, all take up their own places in the life beyond the mill, but the rhythm of the day still moves inside you. A bobbin winder in 1910 Bombay was part of a city changing quickly. Cotton mills had helped reshape labor patterns, neighborhoods, migration, and family economies for decades by then. People came to the city for work, or were born into districts where mill time set the pace of ordinary life. The industrial schedule sat beside older rhythms, market days, religious observances, household duties, monsoon changes, port traffic. No single story covered everyone. But for many workers, the mill imposed a form of repetition that reached beyond the workshop floor. Wake before dawn, walk to the gate, stand through the shift, carry dust home, rise and return. In that sense, the routine of winding did not end with thread. It became part of the wider routine of the city itself. And yet each day was not identical. That is worth remembering. The frame was the same. The room was the same. The line shafts, belts, baskets, and count books were the same. But the material changed. Humidity changed. The neighboring station changed. One lot ran beautifully and let the hours pass almost evenly. Another, like today's marked batch, turned a simple shift into a long act of sorting and salvage. That was the real texture of the work. Repetition with variation, sameness carrying little disturbances inside it. For many listeners now, far from any winding room, that may be the strangest part to imagine. How much alertness could live inside monotony? How a day could feel both repetitive and uncertain? How a hand could learn to read tiny differences so faithfully that a soft patch in yarn became as clear as a spoken warning? But that is often what skill looked like in overlooked jobs, not display, recognition. The experienced worker did not need to announce knowledge. She arranged baskets differently. She slowed one spindle and not another. She tied a smaller knot. She placed one finished bobbin in the doubtful row and another in the count. The knowledge lived in placement, in pacing, in restraint. By the time night settles fully, the mill compound itself will be quieter. Other shifts may move elsewhere. Watchmen may take the place of clerks. Some machines will rest. Some rooms may be cleaned in rough, practical ways. Dust will settle again where hands wiped it away. Tomorrow's empties will wait in their baskets. The difficult holdbacks from today may still be there, depending on the needs of the night and the demands of the morning. Perhaps another worker will take them up. Perhaps you will find them where you left them, like an unfinished sentence. That, too, belongs to the truth of the job. Work was not always completed by the person who began sorting it. Mills were accumulations of partial continuities. Your station at day's end may look finished enough, but hidden in its order are several possible tomorrows. If the next room complains, the marked lot may be remembered. If demand presses harder than caution, some doubtful pieces may still be forced onward. If a better lot comes in first thing, the bad remnants may be pushed aside until later. Industrial routine was full of these quiet negotiations. Not all of them were fair, not all of them were wise. But all of them rested on somebody somewhere having left evidence. And today, that somebody was you. So when people imagine old mills, they often picture scale first. The walls, the engines, the thousands of spindles, the smoke above the district. All of that was real. But scale alone does not explain how the day held together. For that, you have to come down to the size of a thumb pressing a bobbin to test firmness, to a finger finding the rough edge of a tube, to a worker counting softly under her breath so the total survives the noise, to the decision not to mix the doubtful with the sound. Those are the dimensions in which a shift was truly lived. And they are also the dimensions in which fatigue became meaningful, not merely being tired in the abstract, being tired while still needing precision, being tired while still needing honesty, being tired while still keeping things clear for someone else. That is a deep form of labor. Quiet, repetitive, and easy to miss if you are only looking for spectacle. The workshop, if you can still picture it now, is dimmer. The rows are gone from the active floor, except for what remains behind. A few holdbacks, a few marked packages not yet tamed, rejected tubes, the wiped frame, the dust already beginning to settle again. Tomorrow morning, before full light, someone will touch those same objects and read from them what the day before has left. Maybe it will be you again. You will know at once where the troublesome basket was kept. You will see whether the separate row remained separate. You will remember, almost before thinking, how the difficult lot behaved when drawn too fast. And your hands will resume their old negotiations with thread, tension, count, and time. This is one reason repetitive work can feel so strange across days. Nothing dramatic carries over. And yet, everything does. The body remembers, the floor remembers, the arrangement of tools remembers. Even the next shift's first choices are shaped by the careful sorting done before. So the dignity of the bobbin winder's day lies partly in endurance, yes, but also in continuity. You keep continuity from snapping, not perfectly, not forever, just long enough for the next room, the next shift, the next morning. That was the work. That was enough. Somewhere later, perhaps in the warping room, perhaps beside a loom, one of the firmer, doubtful bobbins from this afternoon will begin to unwind. Its fault, if it has one, will show itself then. Or perhaps it will run cleanly after all, and no one will know how closely it was judged before being passed on. Most labor vanishes that way, into use. A well-made object carries silence with it. A merely passable object carries a little uncertainty. And a badly made one forces the hidden history back into view. Tonight, though, none of that is decided yet. The mill has released the day only partway. The accepted bobbins have moved on. The doubtful ones wait. The waste has been seen and named. The count has been entered honestly. That is as complete as this shift can become. The room is quiet now. Not perfectly quiet, because buildings keep small sounds after work. A settling board, a distant footstep, the faint breath of evening through a high window, but quiet enough. The frame stands still, the belts are at rest,